Thank you very much, Daniel, for this nice introduction. Warm welcome on my side to this afternoon session. It's always difficult to be the first to speak after the lunch because we need to catch your attention. But you will see it's a fascinating topic and it's a very interesting study that we have prepared there. It's a study that we did during the election break this year in the spring, and it's very much collective work. As Daniel rightly mentioned, it has been, the lead author was Elena Lazarou, but there are many colleagues of EPRS that have been associated, like Philippe Perchoc and others, and we have worked together very closely with the the Institute for Economics and Peace that Serge is representing today. So, and I would like to thank all the authors involved. To start, I'd like just to put three questions. Why peace? Why the EU and why Normandy? First of all, why peace? Because we think that peace is maybe not at threat, but we see here and there conflicts coming up. We see also new types of threats coming up, like cybersecurity, like climate change, and we see also hybrid threats coming up. So we consider it's an important issue to look at in our study. The second is why the EU has a special role in defending and promoting peace in the world. We believe that the European Union has a special history, the after-war history that was a history of reconciliation, a history of finding ways together within institutions and with legal means rather than conflicts. And this particular situation gives us a mission or a role in the world. The basis for our action as the European Union is, of course, the treaties, but also an important document of 2016, which is the global strategy. And the global strategy has very much, and that will come up in the presentation of the study, a holistic approach, not considering peace as the absence of conflict, but considering peace as something much more large, involving different aspects. And third question, why it's called Normandy Index. Because the European Parliament has an agreement with the Normandy region, and because the Normandy region carries a very strong symbolic value, if you like, of freedom of the continent, of the beginning of the end of Nazism and oppression, and is something that is celebrated in a famous memorial, which is the Memorial of Caen, for those who know. It is the most visited museum outside of the Paris region in France. And of course, it's a Nobel week, and this is the picture of the Nobel Peace Prize that was attributed to the European Union as such 7 years ago. But it's not only looking at peace, it's not only a matter for the institutions or a matter for the policymakers. This is also something that citizens very much expect when they look at the activities of the European Union. Ahead of the elections that took place in the spring this year, the Parliament has conducted several studies looking at what do European citizens expect for the European Union. And out of 15 topics, you can see that 5 of them concern external action. And on these 5 topics, there is a majority or even a large majority, or a very large majority of citizens expecting the European Union to do more. Fight against terrorism, promotion of democracy, migration, protection of external border, security and defense policy at large. Let me come to the index. I mentioned the global strategy that was adopted in 2016. And the global strategy looks at threats that can be a danger for keeping peace. And as you see, these threats are very diverse. They are not just the absence of conflict. Conflict is one of the criteria, but there are many other things. Weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, climate change, cybersecurity, economic crisis, energy insecurity, of course, fragile states, homicides, press freedom, terrorism, and violent conflicts. I already mentioned it. And there is also a positive criteria that we have added to this list of, if you like, negative criteria, which is the quality of democratic processes. So the index is about looking at each of these components and making a mark of 1 to 10, and also having a global evaluation for each of the country. So it's not about the situation of conflicts now. It's also not about if a country is threatening the European Union or its neighbors or the worldwide. It's about the vulnerability of each country, what threatens in each of the country human security on the basis of this basket of criteria. So now we have an example on how we can read the index. So here you have an example with a blue line and an orange line. You recognize around the circle the 11 criteria that I mentioned earlier. And the blue line represents the European Union, and the orange line represents the average worldwide. So you can see that in general, the European Union is better off than the rest of the world. So we are above average. But also we are not immune from weaknesses. For example, and this is the most obvious one, on energy insecurity, we are not doing so well as the rest of the world in average again. Also, although we are doing better than the others, we are not immune from weaknesses on climate change and on cybersecurity. And you can see immediately that with this tool, the index can be used to put policy action on the fields where we feel weaker. But important to notice as well is that indexes are about figures, and figures are not everything. So it's very important to look also at the broader picture, and namely at the qualitative analysis. And in the study that we have written, that is here, that is made available online and also on paper, we have written, at least for 20 of the countries that we have looked at, also a narrative that puts things into context, and that looks also, for example, at the question of hybrid threats. The tool allows us also to do comparisons, a country within a region, so let's say a country within Mercosur, with Mercosur as a region, but also within Latin America as a continent. It allows also to compare worldwide. So just to finish and to give over to Serge for the methodology, how this index can be used for parliamentary work. I think it's important for parliamentary work, first of all, for having a picture of threats in the world, what threatens peace in the world, but it's also important as a way of scrutiny. We had some days ago the hearing for the High Representative Vice President of the Commission, also the Commissioner responsible for development, the Commissioner responsible for trade, for enlargement and the neighborhood, and so on. So this is a very valuable tool. Very soon we will resume the parliamentary work. We'll have hearings for the ambassadors of the Union. So it's a very day-to-day tool for the work of the Parliament. It helps also to do all sorts of comparisons. What I'd like to mention also is that we intend to put the resource online. Now it's, for the moment, it's a brochure or a study in a classical type, but we will, as soon as possible, make some sort of animated infographics where people will be able to use the data and to take benefit of it. With this, I end there, and I hand over to Serge, who will go through methodological aspects.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Is this all right?
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Etienne, and thank you very much for having the Institute for Economics and Peace together with you on the stage, and in the continuation of very good cooperation to establish the Normandy Index. First of all, the Institute for Economics and Peace, or IEP, is a global think tank based in Sydney, Australia, but with regional office throughout the world, and there is an office in Brussels that I'm leading, responsible for Europe and the MENA region. So what we do is quantify peace, measure peace, and also the economic benefits that are related to a more peaceful situation. And Etienne, when you were asking why peace, well, I would say because peace is on the decline. We have seen it over the past decade globally. Peace decreased by 4%, Europe being the most peaceful region of the world. but surrounded by the least peaceful regions of the world, especially the MENA region that has really been a driver for this decrease of peace over the past 10 years. So it's really a neighboring region who really fell down the indexes that we produce and really basically is now manning the bottom 10 of our global index. So that's what we do. So we produce global indexes on peace, on terrorism, and we also develop a concept of positive peace that is aiming at looking at the institutions, the processes, the attitudes to develop, to create, maintain peace, and develop it, and also eventually get the economic returns of the investment in peace. So why do we need to cooperate? I think it's pretty clear. This was an ideal operation on a cooperation between a region, the European Parliament, and I would say an external think tank. It was very important to us to participate in this because this threat-based approach, and you see all the potential indicators that we used, and in the next slide I will explain to you some discussions about the methodology that we had, because this was the first edition, so the discussion about methodology was really important. But for us at the Institute, it was really important to do this study, because this would basically square the circle of existing indexes. So the Global Peace Index would look at the levels of peace, the Positive Peace Index would look at those investments to be made in peace, and the Normandy Index, with this threat-based approach allowed us to basically also look at the potential indicators or the potential threats and issues that would influence the levels of peace. So that's really looking at what is going to determine peace, what are the levels, and what can we do to change the levels, or at least positively influence the levels. As I said, this was the first time that we produced this index. The discussion about methodology was very fierce, and we needed to identify first the indicators that would then, I would say, bring some correlation, or at least have a link with the existing strategic goals of the EU global strategy, and also the availability of data and the quality of data that we could produce. And those are two examples, really. It's almost taken out of the discussion that we had with the research services of the European Parliament, where on two indicators, disinformation and also trans-border crime, it was very, very difficult to find a data set. I mean, the idea to have this indicator was very good, because it was also fitting into this more hybrid warfare influence approach that we tried to put a figure on, but it's very difficult to find an indicator that is really on top of those two elements, especially when you look at disinformation or misinformation. I think this is part of what is now called the hybrid threat, and the entire purpose of the hybrid threat is to influence. So how do you measure influence? Especially when the background of this influence is not overt at all, it's covert, and what you try to avoid is receive the attribution for the influence. So I guess we have evolved over the discussions. We have tried to find better data sets, better indicators, and we are still continuing to do so, and supporting the research services of the European Parliament. This is usually how we present indexes. It's through a world map and a color code, so you can clearly see where the threats are based and how the influences and which countries are most at risks of all the indicators that we have used. Usually when we produce an index like this, the map is interactive. You can really click on every country and get the data and the data sets that we have used for all those countries. This is showing you clearly the top 10. So those countries and those regions, because EU is considered a group of 28 countries that are on the top of the index, so basically reacting very well on the threats posed to them. And as Etienne has shown before, you clearly saw on this web diagram that Europe is really doing very well, maybe except on some of the indicators. So it's clearly a policy tool, because this is showing you where your policy is already successful, and really those areas in which you need to provide, I would say, an additional effort. On the contrary, there is also a bottom 10 to all indexes, and there is nothing. I would say there was no surprise for us when we discovered those countries in the bottom 10. You would find the same type of countries in all our indexes: the Global Peace Index, the Positive Peace Index, the Global Terrorism Index also, and definitely also in in the Normandy Index. Just before giving the floor to, or giving the mic back to Elena, what I would like to say, it's all about, talk a little bit about a concept of positive peace, that is basically looking at how countries can become more resilient, and by doing so, also have less effects of those threats that we have analyzed. And we have seen that countries with high levels of positive peace have better scores in what is called the ESG indicators, so environment, society, or security, and governance, but also on the economic indicators. So this is telling you what is at stake for you and what can influence you. Have a look at your level of peace and then make sure that we invest in the right things to create more peace in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Serge. Good afternoon to everyone. I have to say it's an interesting experience to be a sort of discussant on the panel on the work that we prepared, and I'm finding it fascinating to think more about this. First of all, I'd like to say that this work is really a collaborative product with Philippe Perchoc, my colleague. I would never claim to have done more on this than him. I think it's gender balance that may have me here rather than him, but he always likes to say that he is the Venus and I am the Mars in our project, because I work on defense and he works on peace. So this is always his opening line, so I'm abusing it right now. So what I thought I would do here, now that we've had the project so eloquently and wonderfully presented, was to link this project that we carried out over the past year to the ESPAS ideas that were presented yesterday at the first part of the conference, but also to the topic, to the title that was given to the panel, which I found very inspiring, which is, what is the future of peace? And I thought I'd do this in basically making reference to 3 points that I think very nicely link the work that we did on the Normandy Index with some of the issues that have been mentioned in this conference yesterday and today, but which are found across the whole spectrum of ESPAS products and work on foresight that is around. The first point is about multilateralism and partnerships. And partnering, when it comes to dealing with the future of peace, is a challenging exercise. We found this in the preparation of the Normandy Index through the work we did on actually trying to figure out which threats we were going to use for the index. Because we did not come up with the idea, oh, let's use the global strategy from day one. What we did in another piece of work that is available online, which is our EU Peace and Security Outlook 2019, is we sat down and we started comparing strategic documents from across the G5, the P5 and several G20 countries to see what are the threats to peace that are acknowledged across the board among major democracies mostly and other major countries as the most pressing ones. So you'll find in our EU Peace and Security Outlook that actually the 11 threats mentioned in the EU Global Strategy are perhaps the most comprehensive manifestation of a sum of threats across the board. So just to give you an example, when one looks at the sort of doctrinal strategies of the P5, the EU has 11, whereas the United States has 8. China has, out of these 11, mentions only 3. Climate change is only mentioned as a big threat to security in 2 out of 5 of the P5 countries' big strategic documents. So really, we thought it was a very comprehensive framework, but also, of course, being the EU, we worked on the basis of the global strategy. What this says in terms of multilateralism is to work with others on countering issues related to peace, we also need to agree on what are the threats to peace. So the first thing we do through this document, in a way, is give an idea of who can we work with and what issues when it comes to peace. And that is a basis for how to work multilaterally in the future. The second point I wanted to make has to do with indices themselves and their link to thinking about the future. And of course, indices are mostly a picture of the present, as Serge said. But they can also be tools to think about how this present will influence the future. And in this sense, it is actually not in competition, but actually complementary to other existing indices that we create an index based on the global strategy and on the threats therein mentioned. Because the more such tools we have, the more it will be easier to think about and sort of preempt scenario of the future. So our index really comes to complement other existing ones of the Commission and other types of institutes, the Fragility Index and others that exist around. It's a picture of the world based on the threats described in the global strategy, but it's not to be used on its own, rather as a tool to help think about the future and how to prevent potentially catastrophic events for the future. So in that sense, the index is in a way a tool for foresight, but it's a tool also designed to think about a specific way and a specific type of peace. And it's interesting that in the global strategy, peace gets qualified. It's not just peace. Oftentimes, it's sustainable peace. It's preemptive peace. It can also be a peace based on a particular political economy. So these types of peace resonate with the index that we have created, and which we're very grateful for your help in. A third point and final linking with the future thinking, which is the basis of this conference, I think, interestingly enough, is populism and narratives of peace. We live in a world where peace, precisely because of its not easily defined nature, can be easily abused and used in narratives which justify policies that one could argue are not necessarily peaceful. Just to refer to the ongoing operation, which actually has the name Peace in it, Operation Peace Spring, and people may argue on the objectives of it, but it is a very sort of contradictory issue. So narratives of peace and the abuse of narratives about peace can largely be based on the lack of factual evidence about what are the underlying factors behind peace. In that sense, this fact-based research that we have, and which is, as Etienne expressed, very easy to communicate to the public deliberately. We deliberately created something that is easy to look at and understand. Where is the threat to peace coming from? We hope will be a tool that will be useful for our MEPs and for other policymakers to use and to communicate, also in an effort to disperse narratives that present peace as something that it isn't necessarily. In that context, I'd like to open the discussion, I suppose. Do I get this role as well on this panel? Yes? And thank you very much for presenting the work.